What if the smallest act of kindness you showed to someone invisible was actually the most important test of your life? Madison Hayes had no idea that pouring coffee for a forgotten man in Booth 7 would change everything. For Madison Hayes, the smell of burnt toast and recycled grease was the scent of survival. At 28, she had stopped measuring her life in years and started counting it in shifts. The Harborview Diner in Portland, Maine sat on a corner where hope went to die quietly, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a check-cashing place that charged 20% interest. The linoleum was cracked in patterns that looked like a roadmap to nowhere. The booths were held together with duct tape and prayers. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that felt like it was drilling into her skull after the first hour of every shift. Madison's uniform was faded yellow, the color of old newspaper left in the sun too long. Her name tag was scratched beyond recognition. But the regulars knew her anyway. She was the one who remembered how customers took their coffee, who never forgot to bring extra napkins for the messy eaters, who smiled even when her feet screamed inside shoes with soles worn thin as paper. Her tips went into a mason jar she kept in her locker, the metal cool against her fingers every time she added another crumpled bill or handful of coins. Every penny counted, every single one. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door gave her 14 days. She'd read it so many times the words had burned into her mind like a brand. Her mother's medical bills sat in a drawer she couldn't bear to open anymore. The envelopes stacked like accusations. Hospice care wasn't covered. Pain management wasn't covered. Dignity, apparently, had a price tag Madison couldn't afford. The collection agency had stopped calling. They'd moved straight to legal threats, their letters arriving with the mechanical precision of executioners. At night, Madison lay awake, doing math that never added up. Rent plus bills, plus groceries, plus gas, plus her mother's care equaled more than she made in a month. She'd sold everything worth selling. Her laptop, her television, even the jewelry her grandmother had left her. The pawn shop owner knew her by name now, greeted her with the pitying smile reserved for the desperate. She was down to the wire counting pennies, making choices between electricity and groceries, between her mother's comfort and her own survival. The diner's owner, Dale Carpenter, was a man who saw employees as expenses rather than people. His office sat above the kitchen, a cramped room that smelled like cigar smoke and desperation. He watched the floor through a two-way mirror, his watery eyes tracking every movement, counting every free refill like it was stolen directly from his own pocket. His managers rotated through every few months, each one meaner than the last, ground down by Dale's penny-pinching paranoia until they either quit or became monsters themselves. The current manager, Bryce Sullivan, had the dead eyes of someone who'd given up on happiness and decided to take it out on everyone else. He was 32 but looked 50, his face etched with the lines of someone who'd spent too long breathing grease-soaked air and swallowing his own bitterness. He prowled the floor during rushes, clipboard in hand, marking down imaginary infractions. A customer waiting too long, a coffee refill that came 30 seconds late, a smile that wasn't bright enough. He saw every human moment as a failure of efficiency, every kindness as time theft. Madison's co-workers fell into two categories: the lifers who'd accepted their fate and the young ones still planning their escape. Sarah Chun worked doubles to pay for community college, her textbooks hidden under the register, stealing minutes between orders to study for exams she was too exhausted to properly prepare for. Marcus Wright had 3 kids and a gambling problem, his tips disappearing into scratch-off tickets and desperate hopes. They were all survivors in their own way, all treading water in the shallow end of the American dream. They shared cigarettes on break and complained about customers who left religious pamphlets instead of tips. They were family built from necessity rather than blood, held together by shared exhaustion and the knowledge that nobody else understood what it was like. The diner had its rhythm, its patterns. Morning rush brought construction workers who wanted fuel, not conversation. Coffee black, eggs scrambled, toast dry, everything fast. Lunch was office workers checking their phones between bites, their suits and ties marking them as people from another world, slumming it for cheap food before returning to their air-conditioned offices. The afternoon lull was when the lonely came in, ordering coffee they didn't finish, stretching out the time between leaving and going home to empty apartments. Madison knew all the regulars. She knew who was drinking too much, who was barely holding on, who needed an extra smile to get through their day. Then there was booth 7. The corner booth with the view of the parking lot and the dumpster behind the Chinese restaurant next door. For 3 months, the same man occupied it every afternoon at exactly 2:15. He arrived like clockwork, a thin figure in clothes that had seen better decades. His jacket was brown corduroy with patches at the elbows, the fabric worn smooth and shiny with age. His pants were held up with the belt pulled to the last hole. The leather cracked and faded. His shoes were held together with superglue you could smell if you got close enough, the chemical tang mixing with the coffee and grease. He wore a hat, always the same flat cap that looked like it had survived a war. Maybe it had. The other servers called him the Ghost. He barely spoke. When he did, his voice was rough, like gravel being dragged across concrete. He ordered the same thing every time: black coffee and a slice of apple pie. No ice cream. He paid exact change from a coin purse that looked older than Madison, his trembling fingers counting out pennies and dimes with painful slowness. He never left a tip, not a penny, not ever. The other servers refused to take his table. Sarah said he gave her the creeps, the way he sat there for hours, staring out the window at nothing. Marcus said he was probably homeless, living in his car, nursing one piece of pie for 3 hours because he had nowhere else to go. Bryce told Madison to move him along, that booth warmers hurt business, that every minute he sat there was costing Dale money in potential customers. But the afternoon lull meant empty booths anyway, and Madison knew Bryce just didn't like looking at poverty that close. But Madison saw something else. She saw the way his hands trembled when he lifted the coffee cup, the ceramic chattering against the saucer. She noticed the hearing aid he adjusted constantly, his thick fingers fumbling with the tiny controls. She saw the thick glasses that magnified watery blue eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing. She saw the way he winced when he stood, like every bone in his body was protesting, like gravity itself had become an enemy. She saw someone who was invisible to the world, someone who'd become background noise in his own life, someone who showed up every day to a place where he knew no one wanted him, but it was still better than wherever else he could be. So Madison made a choice, a small one, insignificant to anyone watching. When she brought him his coffee, she made sure it was fresh, not the burnt dregs from the bottom of the pot that had been sitting for hours. When she served his pie, she gave him the slice with the most apples, the one with the perfect lattice crust that actually looked like someone cared when they made it. She refilled his cup without being asked. She wiped down his table even though it was already clean. The gesture, an excuse to linger, to acknowledge his presence. And she talked to him. Not much at first. Just comments about the weather. Observations about the traffic outside. Small things. Safe things. He didn't respond, just gave the slightest nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been a tremor. His watery eyes didn't quite meet hers. But Madison kept going. She told him about her day, about the customer who'd complained that his water wasn't enough, about the seagull that had stolen someone's sandwich right off their plate in the parking lot. She filled the silence with small stories, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing in return. The first week he remained a statue, silent, unreachable. The second week, Sarah cornered Madison in the kitchen. Why are you wasting time on the Ghost? He's never going to tip. He probably doesn't even understand what you're saying. Marcus joined in during their smoke break. You know Bryce is watching you, right? He's timing how long you spend at that table. You're going to get written up for a homeless guy who smells like mothballs. But Madison kept going. Week 3, she told the Ghost about her mother, about how she'd been a nurse for 30 years, about how she'd taught Madison that kindness was the only thing you could give that never ran out. The Ghost's eyes flickered, just for a second. But it was there. Week 4, she mentioned her dream of becoming a teacher, of making a difference in kids' lives the way Mrs. Peterson had made a difference in hers back in middle school. The corner of his mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. It was hard to tell under the weathered landscape of his face. Weeks turned into months. The Ghost remained largely a ghost. But small things changed, tiny adjustments in the fabric of their strange routine. One day in month 2, when Madison refilled his coffee, he made eye contact. Just for a second, his magnified blue eyes meeting hers. But it was there a moment of recognition, of seeing and being seen. Another day, when she told him about her mother's love of old musicals, how she'd play them on repeat in the hospital room. The corner of his mouth definitely twitched. A ghost of a smile on a man everyone called a ghost. Once, when she accidentally brushed his hand reaching for the sugar dispenser, he didn't flinch away. His skin was paper-thin, spotted with age, cool to the touch. But he didn't recoil, didn't retreat into himself. Progress, measured in molecules, in the smallest possible increments of human connection. The other servers thought she was crazy. During the shift change, when the dinner crew came in, they'd whisper about her. There goes St. Madison, wasting her time on the homeless guy. Bryce told her directly, his clipboard clutched like a weapon, that she was wasting time on a customer who'd never tip, that her charity case was dragging down her table turnover rate, that Dale was watching. Dale himself appeared one afternoon, materializing from his office like a troll emerging from under a bridge, and stood with his arms crossed, watching Madison pour the ghost coffee. The message was clear. This was not approved behavior. But Madison had learned something working in this diner, something her mother had taught her long before the medical bills and the collection agencies and the eviction notices. Sometimes the smallest acts of dignity mattered most. Sometimes just being seen was enough. She'd been invisible herself enough times. In the grocery store when she had to count out food stamps, in the landlord's office when she begged for more time, in the emergency room when they asked for her insurance information, to recognize the ache of it in someone else. Her financial situation wasn't improving. The eviction notice had been replaced with a court summons. Her mother's hospice care was eating through what little savings existed like acid through paper. Madison had started sleeping in her car some nights, saving on electricity, showering at the gym she couldn't really afford but needed for basic hygiene. She was down to one meal a day, giving her mother the portions she claimed she wasn't hungry for. The tips in her mason jar were all that stood between her and the street, and the jar never filled fast enough. But every afternoon at 2:15, when the ghost shuffled through the door and made his slow, painful way to booth 7, Madison set aside her panic. She poured his coffee, fresh, always fresh. She served his pie, the best slice, the one that looked like it was made with love instead of obligation. She pulled up a chair during the dead afternoon hours when Bryce was in the back and Dale was in his office and no one was watching. And she told him stories about her life, about her mother, who'd worked night shifts for 30 years so Madison could have new school clothes, about her grandfather, who taught her to play chess and died alone in a veteran's home while everyone was too busy to visit, about Mrs. Peterson, who told a struggling 8th grader that she was smart enough to be anything she wanted, that poverty wasn't a life sentence, about small hopes and smaller victories, finding a $20 bill in an old coat pocket, getting an extra shift, her mother having a good day where the pain wasn't so bad. The ghost never spoke, but he listened. Madison could tell by the way he angled his head, his good ear turned toward her voice, by the way his eyes followed her when she moved around the diner, tracking her movements like she was something worth watching, by the way he waited those extra few minutes before leaving, as if reluctant to step back into whatever life existed outside booth 7. Their afternoons became a ritual, sacred in its simplicity. Two people, separated by decades and circumstances, connected by coffee and pie and the human need to matter to someone. Madison never expected anything in return. That wasn't why she did it. She did it because her mother had taught her that dignity was free to give and priceless to receive. She did it because the ghost reminded her of her grandfather, who died alone because everyone had been too busy, too tired, too caught up in their own survival to sit with him. She did it because in a world that measured worth in dollars and followers and square footage, she believed that every person deserved to be seen, even the ghosts, especially the ghosts. She had no idea she was being tested, no idea that every cup of coffee, every smile, every story she shared was being cataloged and measured. No idea that booth 7 was anything more than a worn vinyl seat in a failing diner in a forgotten corner of Portland. No idea that the ghost saw everything. The way she gave customers extra fries when she thought no one was looking. The way she slipped Marcus $20 when his gambling losses left him short on gas money. The way she never complained even when her feet bled inside her worn-out shoes. She had no idea that everything was about to change. Tuesday afternoon. 2:15 came, and went. Booth 7 remained empty. Madison noticed immediately. Her internal clock, calibrated by 3 months of routine, registered the absence like a missing heartbeat. She glanced at the door during the lunch rush cleanup, expecting to see the ghost's shuffling figure. Nothing. She checked again at 2:20, then 2:30, her hands moving automatically through her tasks while her mind circled the empty booth like it was a crime scene. Sarah noticed her distraction. Your boyfriend stood you up? The joke fell flat. Madison didn't respond, just kept wiping down tables that were already clean, her eyes drifting to the door every few minutes. By 3 o'clock, genuine concern had settled in her chest like stone. The ghost had never missed a day. Not once. Not in 3 months. Rain, snow, heat that made the pavement shimmer. He'd come every single time. Marcus tried to lighten the mood during their break. Maybe he finally found a better diner. One that doesn't smell like disappointment and broken dreams. But even he looked uncomfortable, his cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. They'd all gotten used to the ghost, even if they'd never admitted it. His presence had become part of the diner's architecture, as permanent as the cracked linoleum. Madison couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She thought about him all evening, through the dinner rush and the cleanup. When she locked the diner at 9, she stood in the parking lot and looked at booth 7 through the window. The empty seat looked accusatory in the dim light. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in her car, she'd given up her apartment 2 weeks ago, couldn't make the rent, and stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was okay, wondering if he was alone, wondering if anyone else in the world cared whether an old man in a corduroy jacket showed up for his daily coffee. Wednesday morning, Madison arrived at 6 for the breakfast shift, exhausted and anxious. The morning rush was brutal. Construction workers demanding speed, office workers demanding perfection, everyone demanding something she didn't have the energy to give. Bryce prowled the floor with his clipboard, marking down her mistakes. Coffee delivered 15 seconds late, toast slightly too dark, smile not bright enough. Dale watched from his window, his eyes following her movements with reptilian patience. Then, at 11 o'clock, everything stopped. 6 men entered the Harborview Diner. All of them were over 6 feet tall, built like they spent their lives in gyms and training facilities. They wore identical black suits that probably cost more than Madison made in 6 months, their ties perfectly knotted, their shoes polished to a mirror shine. Each one had a communication earpiece, the kind Secret Service agents wore. They moved with military precision, fanning out across the diner in a formation that was utterly alien to the humble space, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. The entire diner fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the sizzle of the griddle seemed to hush, as if the kitchen itself was holding its breath. Sarah dropped a coffee pot. The crash of ceramic on linoleum sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. Marcus backed against the wall, his eyes wide, his hands raised slightly as if expecting to be arrested. The construction workers at the counter sat perfectly still, their morning aggression replaced by prey animal wariness. These men weren't customers. They were an event. A 7th man entered, and somehow he commanded even more presence than the 6 who'd preceded him. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair styled with precision, and he wore a suit that belonged in boardrooms and courtrooms, not diners. He carried a leather briefcase with gold clasps that caught the fluorescent light. His shoes clicked against the linoleum with a sound that spoke of money and authority in worlds where people like Madison didn't exist. He ignored Dale, who'd emerged from his office and was nervously straightening his stained shirt. He ignored Bryce, who tried to step forward with his clipboard, to assert some kind of management authority. He walked directly past the frozen customers and the gaping staff. His eyes locked on Madison, who was standing behind the counter with a dish rag in her hands, her yellow uniform stained with coffee and ketchup, her hair falling out of its ponytail. He stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, she could see the threads in his suit were probably silk. Could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. Could see the gold cufflinks at his wrists, engraved with initials she couldn't read. Are you Madison Elizabeth Hayes? His voice was formal, careful, the voice of someone who dealt in legal documents and binding contracts. Madison's mouth went dry. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. collection agencies didn't send men in $1,000 suits. The court summons for her eviction hearing wasn't for another week. Her mother's hospice care was current. She'd paid that bill first, always. Yes, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man reached into his briefcase and withdrew a business card, extending it to her with both hands like it was something sacred. My name is Robert Chin, senior partner at Whitmore & Associates. I represent the estate of Mr. Harold James Pemberton III. The name meant nothing to Madison. Her confusion must have shown on her face because Robert Chen's expression softened slightly, something human flickering behind the professional mask. You may have known him by a different name, or perhaps no name at all. He was a regular customer here. He occupied booth 7 every afternoon. The world tilted. Madison's hands went numb. The dish rag fell to the floor. The ghost, she whispered. I regret to inform you that Mr. Pemberton passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 nights ago. The words landed like physical blows. Madison's vision blurred. She gripped the counter to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the scarred formica. 2 nights ago, Tuesday, the day he didn't come, the day booth 7 stayed empty. While she'd been worried he'd been dying, while she'd been hoping he'd show up the next day, he'd already been gone. Grief hit her like a wave, shocking in its intensity. She'd barely known him, didn't even know his real name until 30 seconds ago. But she'd known him in the ways that mattered, known the tremor in his hands, the way he took his coffee, the almost smile when she told him stories, known the weight of his loneliness because it matched her own. And now he was gone, and she'd never told him that those afternoons mattered, that he mattered. I'm sorry, Robertson said, and he sounded like he meant it. I understand this is difficult. However, Mr. Pemberton's final will and testament contains a provision that requires your immediate presence. Madison looked up at him through tears. She didn't remember starting to cry. What? The reading of Mr. Pemberton's will is scheduled for this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Your attendance is not optional. It is a legal requirement. The diner was still silent. Every customer, every coworker was watching this unfold like it was a television show. Sarah's mouth hung open. Marcus looked like he might faint. Dale had retreated to his office doorway, his face pale. Bryce stood frozen with his clipboard, for once in his life completely out of his depth. Madison's mind couldn't process what was happening. I don't understand. Why would I need to be at his will reading? I'm nobody. I just serve him coffee. Robert Chen's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Knowledge he wasn't sharing yet. Mr. Pemberton was quite specific about your attendance. The will cannot be executed without you present. But I have a shift. I can't just leave. Bryce, tell him I can't. Bryce found his voice. You can go. Take the day. It's fine. The words came out strangled. Dale nodded frantically from his doorway, suddenly cooperative in a way he'd never been before. The presence of lawyers and men in expensive suits had a way of making petty tyrants remember their place. I'll need a change, Madison said, looking down at her stained uniform, suddenly aware of how she must look to these men in their perfect suits. I'm not dressed for. There's no time, Robertson said gently. The reading begins in 45 minutes. My car is outside. We need to leave now. One of the suited men opened the diner's door, holding it like Madison was someone important, someone who mattered. The absurdity of it made her head spin. 12 hours ago, she'd slept in her car. This morning, she'd served burned eggs to construction workers. And now men in black suits were holding doors for her like she was visiting royalty. She looked back at Sarah, at Marcus, at the diner that had been her entire world for 3 years. They stared back at her like she'd become a stranger, like she'd already left and traveled somewhere they couldn't follow. Maybe she had. Madison walked toward the door on legs that didn't feel like her own. As she passed booth 7, she touched the back of the seat where the ghost, where Harold, had sat every day for 3 months. The vinyl was cool under her palm, empty. She'd never see him there again, never refill his coffee or tell him stories or receive his almost smiles. Subscribe now, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about that empty booth. She stepped outside into the October sunshine. A black Mercedes SUV idled at the curb, its engine purring with the quiet confidence of machines that cost more than houses. The door was already open, waiting for her. Madison climbed inside, her worn shoes squeaking against leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent used to be. The door closed with a solid, expensive sound. Through the tinted window, she could see the diner, Dale, Bryce, Sarah, and Marcus all pressed against the glass, watching her drive away. The construction workers, the office workers, all of them witnesses to something they didn't understand. Neither did Madison. But as the Mercedes pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just divided into before and after. Before this moment, after this moment, before Harold, after Harold. She just had no idea how much after would cost, or how much it would give back. The ride through Portland felt like crossing into another dimension. The Mercedes moved with the smooth silence of wealth, its leather seats smelling like money and privilege in worlds Madison had only ever glimpsed from the outside. She sat in her stained yellow uniform, acutely aware of the coffee smell that clung to her clothes, the grease under her fingernails, the way her hair had given up on the ponytail hours ago. Her reflection in the tinted window showed a ghost, pale, exhausted, out of place. The driver said nothing. Robertson sat in the front passenger seat, typing on his phone with quick, precise movements. The suited men followed in 2 additional SUVs, a convoy fit for someone important. Madison was none of those things. She was a waitress who couldn't make rent, a daughter watching her mother die by degrees, a woman who'd been sleeping in her car for 2 weeks because the shelter had a waiting list. The downtown towers grew larger as they drove, glass and steel monuments to success she'd never touch. The streets changed from cracked pavement to smooth asphalt, from chain-link fences to manicured hedges. They passed restaurants where a single meal cost more than Madison made in a day, office buildings where people in expensive suits made decisions that affected thousands of lives, banks, investment firms, law offices with names etched in gold. The Mercedes pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a building that seemed to scrape the sky. Casco Tower. Madison had walked past it 1,000 times, never imagining she'd enter. The elevator ride to the 31st floor felt like ascending to heaven or hell. She wasn't sure which. Her ears popped, her stomach churned. The numbers climbed with mechanical indifference. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 31. The doors opened onto a lobby that looked like it belonged in a museum. Marble floors polished to mirrors. Chandeliers that probably cost more than college tuition. Original artwork on the walls. Not prints, but actual paintings with signatures and gallery labels. A reception desk manned by 2 women in designer clothes who looked at Madison's uniform with barely concealed disdain. Their smiles were professional masks that didn't reach their eyes. Whitmore and Associates, Robertson announced. This way, please. Madison's worn shoes squeaked on the marble. Every eye in the lobby tracked her movement. She felt like a stain on their perfect world. Reminder of poverty they'd worked very hard to forget existed. Her hands shook, her heart hammered. She wanted to run back to the elevator, back to the diner, back to a world where she understood the rules. Robert led her down a hallway lined with doors bearing names followed by impressive letters. JD MBA, CFP, Partners, Senior Associates. The hierarchy of wealth and power made visible. At the end of the hall, double doors stood open to a conference room that took Madison's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Portland Harbor. She could see the water, the boats, the islands dotting Casco Bay. The view alone probably cost more per month than she'd make in a year. The conference table was mahogany, long enough to seat 20 people, polished until it gleamed. Leather chairs surrounded it, the kind that probably adjusted in 17 different ways. 2 people were already seated. The woman was in her early 40s, wearing a designer dress in emerald green that strained at the seams. Diamonds glittered on every finger, rings that caught the light and threw it back like weapons. Her hair was professionally colored and styled, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who'd never had to rush through a morning routine. Her face was set in a permanent scowl, lips pressed thin, eyes hard as stones. She looked at Madison the way someone might look at something they'd scraped off their shoe. The man beside her was in his mid-30s, wearing an expensive suit that somehow looked cheap on him. His chin was weak, his shoulders slumped despite what was probably a personal trainer's best efforts. He was already sweating, dark patches spreading under his arms. His eyes kept darting between Madison and the woman, seeking approval, seeking direction. "This is who we've been waiting for." The woman's voice cut like a knife. "A waitress." Robert Chen's expression didn't change. "May I present Victoria Pemberton and Trevor Pemberton, Mr. Pemberton's daughter and grandson." He gestured to Madison. "And this is Madison Hayes." Victoria's lip curled. "The help? How delightful. I'm sure this won't take long." Madison wanted to disappear, wanted to apologize for existing, wanted to explain that she didn't belong here, didn't understand why she'd been summoned, was just as confused as they were angry. But her throat had closed. Her voice had abandoned her. "Please, Miss Hayes, have a seat." Robert indicated a chair directly across from Victoria and Trevor. Madison sat, the leather creaking under her, expensive and accusatory. She clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. Her uniform felt like a costume, marking her as an imposter in this temple of wealth. Robert took his position at the head of the table and withdrew a thick document from his briefcase. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Harold James Pemberton III. Let the record show that all required parties are present." He paused, his eyes moving between the three of them. "Before we begin, I must inform you that Mr. Pemberton was of sound mind and body when this will was executed 6 months ago. It has been reviewed by 3 independent psychiatrists and deemed legally binding. Any challenges to its validity will need to meet an extremely high legal threshold." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her diamonds catching the light. "Get on with it." Robert opened the document. His voice took on a formal cadence, the rhythm of legal language refined over centuries. "I, Harold James Pemberton III, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament." He looked up. The document begins with several charitable provisions. To the Portland Historical Society, $50,000. To the Maine Veterans Association, $100,000. To the... "We don't care about the charities," Victoria interrupted. "Those are rounding errors. Move to the real provisions." Robert's expression hardened slightly, but he continued. "Very well. To my daughter, Victoria Pemberton. I leave the family residence located at 247 Shore Road, Cape Elizabeth, Maine, currently valued at $2.3 million. Additionally, I leave to Victoria the sum of $5 million for my liquid assets." Victoria's face flushed red. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "That's it? $5 million and the house." Trevor shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, don't believe me. $5 million? Do you have any idea what that man was worth? This is insulting. This is a slap in the face." Robert continued as if she hadn't spoken. "To my grandson, Trevor Pemberton, I leave the vacation property located in Bar Harbor, Maine, valued at $1.8 million. Additionally, I leave to Trevor the sum of $3 million. Trevor's face fell. He'd clearly expected more. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at his mother, who looked ready to explode. Madison sat frozen, wondering why she was here. Clearly, she wasn't part of the family. Clearly, this was a mistake. She should excuse herself, apologize for the confusion, let them finish their family business in peace. Then Robert Chen's eyes moved to her, to Madison Elizabeth Hayes, whose kindness asked nothing in return. "I leave the sum of $250,000. The room stopped. Time stopped. Madison's brain refused to process the words. $250,000. It wasn't possible. There had been a mistake, a misunderstanding. Harold, the ghost, he'd been homeless, or nearly so. He'd paid for coffee and pie with exact change from a coin purse. He'd worn clothes held together with patches and hope. Victoria exploded. She shot to her feet, her chair flying backward. "Are you kidding me? $250,000 to some random waitress who brought him pie? This is insane." He was clearly senile, incompetent. She manipulated him. She probably seduced him, got him confused, took advantage of... "Mrs. Pemberton," Robert's voice cut through her tirade. like steel. I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully. Making accusations of impropriety without evidence can have serious legal consequences. Trevor had gone pale. He stared at Madison like she'd grown a second head. Who even is she? How did she know grandfather? Madison found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. I didn't know him. Not really. He came to the diner where I work. Every day. I serve him coffee. That's all. That's all? Victoria's laugh was cruel, sharp. You served him coffee, and he left you $250,000? Do you think we're stupid? Do you think? There's more, Robert said quietly. The room fell silent. Victoria slowly sat back down, her eyes narrowed. Trevor leaned forward, his hands gripping the table edge. Madison couldn't breathe. Robert turned a page. Additionally, Miss Hayes is to receive the property located at 1847 Harbor Street, Portland, Maine. Madison's mind spun. 1847 Harbor Street. That was the diner. Harborview Diner, where she worked. Harold had owned the diner where she worked? Victoria started laughing. It was a terrible sound, high and mocking. Oh, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. He leaves her that dump? That health code violation waiting to happen? That place has been condemned twice. The roof leaks. The plumbing doesn't work. It's worth maybe $50,000 on a good day. And that's being generous. She turned to Madison, her smile vicious. Congratulations, sweetheart. You got your inheritance. $250,000 and a building that's falling apart. I hope it was worth whatever you did to earn it. Trevor joined in, his laughter nervous but cruel. Grandfather's last joke. The waitress gets the diner. How poetic. Madison felt tears burning in her eyes. She'd been grateful. $250,000 was more money than she'd see in a lifetime. Could pay her mother's care, could give her a chance to breathe. But Victoria was right. The diner was worthless. Dale barely kept it running. The equipment broke constantly. The whole place smelled like failure. Harold had given her money with one hand and taken it back with the other by saddling her with a property that would drain every penny she had. Robert Chen's expression hadn't changed. He waited for the laughter to die down. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the words detonated like a bomb. Included with the Harbor Street property is the commercial real estate portfolio attached to that address. The portfolio comprises 17 buildings in Portland's Old Port District. The buildings are currently leased to various commercial tenants, generating approximately $640,000 annually in rental income. The portfolio's current market value is estimated at $8.2 million. The laughter stopped. Victoria's face drained of color. Trevor's mouth fell open, his eyes bulging. Robert wasn't finished. Additionally, Miss Hayes receives Mr. Pemberton's 40% stake in Pemberton Holdings, LLC, the private equity firm managing his real estate investments across New England. The stake is currently valued at approximately $47 million. The conference room erupted. Victoria shot to her feet again, this time moving toward the table like she might climb over it. No, absolutely not. This is fraud. This can't be legal. You can't give $55 million to some nobody who... The will is legally binding, Robert said, his voice cutting through her rage. Mr. Pemberton's mental competence has been documented extensively. He knew exactly what he was doing. Trevor looked like he might vomit. $47 million? To her? But we're family. We're his blood. How can some waitress get more than his own family? Madison couldn't move, couldn't think. The numbers didn't make sense. 8.2 million, 47 million, 55 million total. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The ghost, Harold. He'd worn clothes from thrift stores. He'd counted out exact change in pennies. He'd sat in a diner drinking coffee that cost $2. There must be a mistake, Madison whispered. Harold he didn't have money. He could barely afford pie. Robertson looked at her, and for the first time, something like sympathy crossed his face. Miss Hayes, Harold James Pemberton III, was worth approximately $218 million at the time of his death. He was one of Maine's wealthiest men. He built a real estate empire over 50 years, owns half of Portland's waterfront, and developed some of New England's most successful commercial properties. The room spun. Madison gripped the edge of a table, her knuckles white. No, That's not. I would have known. Someone would have told me. Nobody told you, Robert said quietly. Because that was precisely the point. Victoria sank back into her chair, her face contorted with rage and shock, and something that looked like grief. Not for her father, Madison realized. For the money, for the inheritance she'd thought was hers, for the empire she'd expected to control. Trevor put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. Madison couldn't tell if he was crying or laughing or both. And Madison sat in her stained yellow uniform, in a conference room overlooking Portland Harbor, and tried to understand how the man who'd sat in booth 7 silent, alone, invisible to everyone but her, had been worth more than she could comprehend. How the person she'd served coffee to out of simple human kindness had owned the building she'd worked in, the street it sat on, and half the city she'd grown up in. How her life had just changed forever in ways she couldn't begin to process. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The truth gets darker from here. Victoria wasn't finished. She stood again, her hands gripping the table edge, her diamonds catching the light like weapons. I want that will challenged. Today, right now, my father was clearly not in his right mind. Giving away millions to a stranger? To someone who served him coffee? It's evidence of diminished capacity, dementia, Alzheimer's, something. Robert Chen reached into his briefcase again, his movements deliberate. I anticipated this response. Mr. Pemberton did, as well. He placed a thick folder on the table. This contains medical evaluations from 3 independent psychiatrists, all conducted within the last 6 months. Dr. Patricia Rosen from Maine Medical Center, Dr. James Wu from Boston General, Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Portland Psychiatric Institute. All 3 evaluated Mr. Pemberton extensively. All 3 concluded he was of sound mind, with no evidence of cognitive decline, dementia, or any condition that would affect his decision-making capacity. He slid the folder toward Victoria, who snatched it up and began flipping through pages, her face growing paler with each one. Trevor leaned over her shoulder, reading frantically. Additionally, Robert continued, Mr. Pemberton maintained detailed journals documenting his reasoning for every provision in this will. He knew there would be challenges. He prepared for them. Another folder appeared. These are excerpts from those journals, dated and notarized. They make his intentions abundantly clear. Madison's head was spinning. She couldn't reconcile the silent man in booth 7 with someone who'd planned this elaborately, who'd anticipated legal battles and documented everything. It felt like learning someone she'd known was actually a stranger, or that the stranger she'd thought she'd known had been someone else entirely. Robert opened the journal folder. With your permission, I'd like to read some relevant passages. They explain a great deal about Mr. Pemberton's state of mind and his reasoning. Please, Madison whispered. She needed to understand, needed to know why. Robert adjusted his reading glasses. Entry dated April 15th, 6 months ago. Eleanor has been gone for 5 years now. 5 years of this empty house, these empty rooms, this empty life. The business runs itself. The money multiplies. None of it means anything without her. I've been thinking about her last words to me. She said, "Don't let it make you cruel, Harold. Don't let the money turn you into something I wouldn't recognize." I'm afraid I've already failed that test. Victoria made a sound of protest, but Robert continued. Entry dated May 3rd. I went to Harborview Diner today. My first investment, made 48 years ago with money Eleanor and I saved from our first jobs. We were going to flip it, sell it, make a profit. But Eleanor fell in love with it, said it was a place where working people could afford to eat, could sit for a while, could feel human. We kept it, never raised the rents on it. It was our little secret, a piece of our beginning that we protected from the empire we built. Madison's breath caught. Eleanor. Harold had mentioned that name once, during one of their one-sided conversations. She told him about her mother, and he'd nodded, and his lips had formed a single word. Eleanor. She thought he was confused, remembering someone else. Now she understood. Robert turned a page. Entry dated May 10th. I went back to the diner again. Nobody recognized me. Why would they? I dressed in old clothes, drove my first car, the 1987 Honda I've kept in storage for decades. The staff looked through me like I was furniture. The owner, Dale, actually asked me to leave because I was occupying valuable booth space. I felt like a ghost. It was oddly freeing. This is ridiculous, Victoria interjected. He was clearly having some kind of breakdown, dressing in old clothes. Pretending to be poor? That's not the behavior of a sane person. That's the behavior of someone conducting a test, Robert replied. Entry dated May 18th. There's a waitress named Madison. She's different from the others. When I sat down today, she actually looked at me, not threw me at me, like I was a person worth seeing. The other servers won't take my table. The manager tells her to move me along, but she brings me fresh coffee, not the burnt stuff from the bottom of the pot. I watched her pour from a new pot. Such a small thing, but Eleanor would have done the same. Madison felt tears streaming down her face. She remembered that day, remembered Bryce telling her to stop wasting time on the homeless guy in booth 7. Remembered making fresh coffee because the old pot had been sitting for hours, and nobody deserved to drink that bitter sludge, not even someone who couldn't afford to tip. Robert's voice softened as he continued reading. Entry dated June 2nd. Madison told me about her mother today, about how she's dying, how the medical bills are crushing her, how she sold her grandmother's jewelry just to make rent. She told me this while serving me pie, the best slice I noticed with the most apples. She has nothing, less than nothing. She's drowning. And still, she makes sure I get fresh coffee and the best slice of pie. Still, she talks to me like I'm worth her time. Eleanor used to say you can judge a person's character by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Madison passes that test every single day. Victoria's hands were shaking. Trevor had gone silent, his face pale. Madison couldn't stop crying, couldn't catch her breath. Harold had known. He'd known everything. While she'd been telling him her troubles, pouring out her life to fill the silence. He'd been listening, really listening, recording, understanding. Entry dated July 20th. Robert continued. I hired a private investigator to research Madison Hayes, not because I suspected deception, but because I needed to be certain. The report came back yesterday. She has no idea who I am. 0 internet searches for Harold Pemberton. No suspicious inquiries. No attempts to find out if the old man in booth 7 has money. She treats me well because that's who she is, not because of what she thinks she can get. Eleanor would have loved her. Robert produced another folder, this one thicker. These are the private investigator's reports. 3 months of surveillance, documentation of every interaction between Mr. Pemberton and Miss Hayes, proof that she never researched his identity, never made inquiries, never deviated from simply being kind to someone she believed had nothing. He slid photographs across the table. Madison saw herself in them, serving coffee, wiping down booth 7, sitting in the empty seat across from Harold during slow afternoon hours, talking while he listened. Seeing herself through a stranger's camera lens was surreal, like watching an actress play her life. There's more, Robert said. He produced a tablet and pressed play on a video file. The screen showed the interior of Harborview Diner, shot from a high angle. Mr. Pemberton had a security camera installed in the diner, with the owner's permission, of course, though Dale didn't know why Harold wanted it. The footage is comprehensive. The video played. Madison watched herself move through the diner, serving customers, cleaning tables. Then she saw herself approach booth 7, where Harold sat hunched over his coffee. The footage had audio. She could hear her own voice, bright and warm despite the exhaustion she remembered feeling that day. The seagulls were crazy this morning. One of them stole Mrs. Patterson's entire sandwich right off her plate. She shrieked, so loud I thought someone was being murdered. Harold didn't respond, but the camera caught something Madison hadn't seen in person. A small smile, brief, almost invisible, but there. He'd been listening. He'd been amused. The footage continued. Day after day, week after week, Madison bringing fresh coffee, Madison giving him the best slice of pie, Madison sitting across from him during the slow hours, filling the silence with stories about her mother, her dreams, her life. The camera caught her slipping Marcus $20 when he came up short on gas money, caught her giving extra fries to a construction worker who looked hungry, caught her staying late to help Sarah study for an exam. It also caught the other servers. Caught them refusing to take booth 7. Caught Dale telling Madison she was wasting time. Caught Bryce threatening to write her up for spending too long with a homeless guy. Caught customers being rude, dismissive, cruel. And through it all, Harold sat silent, watching, measuring, recording. Entry dated September 1st. Robert read, "I've made my decision. Victoria will be comfortable. The house, $5 million. She'll complain it's not enough. It never was with her. Trevor gets $3 million. He'll lose it gambling within 5 years. But that's his choice to make. The charities get their portions. And Madison gets what Eleanor and I built together. Not because she earned it through blood, but because she earned it through character. She reminds me of Eleanor in every way that matters. She has her heart." Robert looked up from the journal. "There's a letter as well. Mr. Pemberton left it for Miss Hayes specifically. With your permission, Madison, I'd like to read it." Madison nodded, incapable of speech. Her throat was raw from crying. Her hands trembled in her lap. Robert opened an envelope, removing a single sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting. "Dear Madison," he began, "if you're hearing this, I'm dead. Sorry about that. I would have preferred to have this conversation in person, but that would have ruined the test." And yes, it was a test. I'm not proud of the deception, but I needed to know. When Eleanor died, I lost faith in humanity. I'd spent 50 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence. People treated me well, but it was the money they saw, not me. When Eleanor got sick, suddenly everyone was my friend. Everyone had suggestions, treatments, specialists they knew. Everyone wanted to help the billionaire's dying wife. Not because they cared about Eleanor, but because they cared about staying in the billionaire's good graces. After she died, I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Who was real? Who was just performing kindness because they thought it might pay off? I became cynical, bitter. The thing Eleanor had warned me not to become. So I went back to where we started, Harborview Diner. Our first investment, our first risk, our first success. I dressed in old clothes and sat in booth 7 and waited to see if anyone would treat me like a human being when I had nothing to offer in return. Most people failed that test, but you didn't. You gave me fresh coffee when no one was watching. You gave me the best slice of pie when you could have given me the worst. You talked to me when you were exhausted, when your own life was falling apart, when you had every reason to save your energy for yourself. You treated me with dignity when dignity was the only thing I was asking for. The money is for your freedom. Pay your debts. Take care of your mother. Give yourself room to breathe. The diner and the portfolio are for your heart. Keep them or sell them, your choice. But know they represent everything Eleanor and I built together. And the stake in Pemberton Holdings is for your future. You have Eleanor's character. I trust you'll use these resources the way she would have to help people, to create opportunities, to remember that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you who I was. I'm sorry I let you think I was just an old man with nothing. But I needed to know, and now I do. You passed a test you didn't know you were taking. That's the only kind of test that matters. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the fresh coffee and the stories and the dignity. Thank you for reminding me that people like Eleanor still exist. That kindness isn't dead. That character still matters. I hope this changes your life. You've already changed mine. With gratitude, Harold. The conference room was silent except for Madison's quiet sobs. Robert folded the letter carefully and slid it across the table to her. She picked it up with shaking hands, holding the paper like it was something sacred. Victoria sat motionless, her face unreadable. Trevor stared at the table, his jaw clenched. The fight had gone out of them. What could they say? Harold's intentions were documented, witnessed, legally binding. He'd been testing everyone in his life, and only Madison had passed. There's one more thing, Robert said quietly. He placed a final photograph on the table. It showed Eleanor Pemberton, taken perhaps 30 years ago. She wore a simple dress and an apron, standing behind the counter of Harborview Diner. She was smiling, her face lit with joy, holding a coffee pot in one hand and a plate of pie in the other. Eleanor used to work at that diner, Robert explained. It's how she and Harold met. She was a waitress. He was a young man with a dream and no money. She gave him free coffee when he couldn't afford to pay, gave him advice, gave him hope when they bought the diner together years later. She insisted they keep it the way it was, a place where people like her, people struggling to survive, could find a moment of kindness. She made Harold promise never to change it, never to raise the rents, never to let it become something different. He looked at Madison. You didn't just remind Harold of Eleanor. You were doing exactly what Eleanor did, in the same place, serving the same coffee and pie, showing the same kindness to someone everyone else had dismissed. Harold didn't just test you. He found proof that Eleanor's legacy was still alive. Madison looked at the photograph, at Eleanor's smile, at the diner in the background, 40 years younger, but somehow exactly the same, at the coffee pot and the pie, and the simple act of feeding someone who needed feeding. She understood now. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about carrying forward something that mattered more than wealth could measure. It was about proving that in a world that measured worth in dollars, some people still measured it in dignity. Harold had been looking for someone to carry Eleanor's light forward, and somehow impossibly, he'd found her pouring coffee in booth 7. That night, Madison sat on the floor of her car in the diner's parking lot and wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears she'd cried in the conference room, but raw, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. She held Harold's letter in her hands. The paper crumpled from her grip and let 5 years of exhaustion pour out of her. She called the hospice first. Her hand shook so badly she could barely dial. When the administrator answered, Madison could barely form words. This is Madison Hayes. My mother is Catherine Hayes, room 304. I need to pay her account in full. There was a pause. Miss Hayes, the balance is quite substantial. We've discussed payment plans. I know. I want to pay all of it. Today. Right now. Whatever it takes to keep her comfortable. Whatever she needs. I don't care what it costs. Another pause, longer this time. Miss Hayes, are you sure? The total amount is... I'm sure. Send me the invoice. I'll have my attorney handle the wire transfer in the morning. The words felt foreign in her mouth. My attorney. Wire transfer. Words that belonged to other people. People who lived in different worlds. But they were her words now. She called her landlord next, the man who'd served her with eviction papers. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice already annoyed. Miss Hayes, if this is about the court date, I want to pay 6 months' rent in advance. And I want to cover any legal fees I've cost you. Whatever the amount is, I'll pay it. Silence. Then, is this some kind of joke? No joke. I'll have the money transferred tomorrow. Is that acceptable? Yes. Yes, that's acceptable. He sounded stunned. Madison understood the feeling. She called the collection agencies, all 4 of them, listened to their scripts about payment arrangements and settlement offers, then interrupted. I want to pay the full balance. Today. All of it. The surprise in their voices would have been funny if Madison had any laughter left in her. She'd been their problem account, their difficult case, the woman who couldn't pay. Now she was paying everything, and they didn't know how to process it. By midnight, she'd made 17 phone calls, paid off her medical debt or credit card debt, her student loans from the single semester of community college she'd managed before her mother got sick, cleared every number that had haunted her for 5 years. With each payment, she felt lighter, like chains are falling away. Not happiness, not yet. She was too overwhelmed for happiness. But relief, space to breathe, room to exist without constantly calculating survival. She looked at her bank account balance on her phone. After all those payments, after clearing every debt that had crushed her for years, she still had over $180,000. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Money that represented freedom, possibility, choice. She sat in her car and tried to comprehend it. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. The next morning, she walked into Harborview Diner at 6 a.m. for the breakfast shift. She was still wearing yesterday's uniform. She'd slept in her car, as usual, though for the last time. She called a realtor that morning, asked about apartments, places with actual beds, and heat and windows that locked. The realtor had nearly cried when Madison said she could pay cash for a year up front. Dale was already in his office, visible through his two-way mirror. He saw her enter and emerged immediately, his face a mask of false friendliness that hadn't been there yesterday. "Madison, good morning. We need to talk about your schedule. I was thinking maybe you'd want fewer shifts now that you're—" "I'm here to work," Madison said quietly. "Same as always. But surely you don't need to. I mean, you're going to be busy with all that property management and—" "I'm here to work," she repeated, then added for now. Bryce appeared from the kitchen, his clipboard conspicuously absent. "Madison, hey, listen, about yesterday, I may have been a little harsh about your time management. I think you've been doing a great job, actually. Really great. Employee of the month material even." Sarah and Marcus watched from behind the counter, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and wariness. They'd all seen Madison leave in the Mercedes, seen her summoned by lawyers in expensive suits. Now she was back, in the same uniform, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and they knew it. The breakfast rush started. Madison fell into the rhythm automatically, pouring coffee, taking orders, delivering plates. But her mind was elsewhere, working through problems she'd never had to consider before. She owned this building. She owned the buildings surrounding it. She owned a piece of a company worth tens of millions of dollars. What did that mean? What was she supposed to do with it? At 10 a.m., when the rush slowed, she asked Dale and Bryce to gather everyone in the dining area. Sarah, Marcus, the cook, the dishwasher, the 2 part-time servers who worked evenings. They assembled slowly, reluctantly, their faces showing fear. Madison understood. New ownership usually meant changes. Changes usually meant layoffs. She stood in front of them, still in her yellow uniform, and took a breath. "You all know something happened yesterday. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. Harold Pemberton, the man you called the ghost, left me some things in his will. One of those things was this diner." The staff exchanged glances. Dale's face went pale. Bryce looked like he might faint. "I know what you're thinking," Madison continued. "You're thinking I'm going to fire everyone, change everything, bring in new people, maybe sell the place to developers." She paused, looking at each of them. "I'm not going to do any of that." Relief flickered across faces, but the wariness remained. "Here's the truth. I don't know how to run a business. I know how to pour coffee and serve pie. I know how to work a shift. But managing a diner? Managing multiple properties? I have no idea what I'm doing." She looked at Dale. "You've kept this place running for 20 years. I need you to keep doing that, with a raise, a significant one." Dale's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You're not firing me? Nobody's getting fired. This diner works because of you. All of you. I'm not stupid enough to think I can do this alone." She turned to Sarah. "You're going to community college, right? Business administration." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'd like to hire you as assistant manager. Part-time, flexible hours around your classes. You'll help me understand the business side of things. I'll pay your tuition. All of it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Madison, I can't." "Yes, you can. You're brilliant. You're organized. You're exactly who I need." Madison turned to Marcus. "You have a family, 3 kids. I'm giving you a raise and full benefits. Health insurance, dental, the works. And if you want help with other things, I know people now. People who can help." Marcus's hands were shaking. He nodded, unable to speak. "This place meant something to Harold and Eleanor," Madison continued. "It was where they started, where they fell in love, where they proved that business could be about more than profit. I'm not going to change that. I'm going to protect it." She looked around at the cracked linoleum, the duct tape booths, the flickering fluorescent lights. "We'll fix things that are broken, update equipment that needs updating. But the heart of this place stays the same. We're still going to be a place where working people can afford to eat, where everyone gets treated with dignity, where nobody is invisible." Bryce cleared his throat nervously. "And my position?" Madison considered him. 24 hours ago, she would have been terrified to meet his eyes. Now she saw him clearly, a man ground down by Dale's paranoia and his own bitterness, lashing out because he'd never been shown kindness himself. "You keep your job, but things change. No more writing people up for showing customers basic human decency. No more timing how long servers spend making sure someone feels welcome. This isn't a factory. It's a community. Start treating it like one." Bryce nodded slowly. Something that might have been shame crossed his face. 2 days later, the walk-in freezer died. The compressor had been struggling for months, limping along on prayers and duct tape. When it finally gave out, Dale's first instinct was what it always had been. File an insurance claim, let the food spoil, close the diner for a week while they waited for the money to come through. Save the repair cost. Don't spend unless absolutely necessary. Madison overheard him on the phone with the insurance company and made a different choice. She called the commercial refrigeration company, explained the emergency, and offered to pay triple their normal rate if they could fix it that day. They arrived within 2 hours. The freezer was running again by dinner time. The food was saved. The diner stayed open. Nobody lost wages. The repair cost $8,000. Dale looked at the invoice with horror. Madison, that's our profit margin for the entire month. We can't afford. We can, Madison said quietly. And we did. That afternoon, while the refrigeration technicians worked, Madison sat in booth 7 and cried again. Not from grief this time, but from the strange vertigo of having power. Real power. The power to make decisions that protected people instead of profit margins. The power to choose compassion over convenience. The power to be the kind of employer Harold and Eleanor had been, instead of the kind Dale had become. Sarah found her there, tears streaming down her face. She slid into the booth across from Madison, the same seat Madison had occupied when talking to Harold. You okay? I spent 5 years unable to fix anything, Madison whispered. Couldn't pay my bills. Couldn't help my mother. Couldn't even keep a roof over my head. And now I can just fix things. Just like that. It doesn't feel real. It's real, Sarah said. You saved everyone's jobs today. You know that, right? If we closed for a week, half the staff would have missed rent. Marcus would have lost his car. I would have had to drop my classes. She reached across the table and took Madison's hand. You didn't just inherit money. You inherited the ability to make choices that matter. And you're making the right ones. Over the next 2 weeks, Madison made more choices. She hired a management company to handle the 17 buildings in her commercial portfolio. But she read every report, attended every meeting, learned the business from the ground up. She met with the tenants personally, small business owners, artists, nonprofits, and learned their stories. One restaurant was struggling with rent. Madison restructured their lease. A bookstore was facing eviction from a previous landlord's decision. Madison canceled it. She wasn't trying to be a savior. She was trying to be what Harold and Eleanor had been. Landlords who understood that buildings housed dreams, not just businesses. That rent payments came from real people with real struggles. That wealth was a responsibility to be stewarded, not just accumulated. The staff at Harborview Diner stopped looking at her with wariness, started looking at her with something else. Respect, trust, maybe even hope. Marcus stopped gambling. Madison had connected him with a counselor, paid for the sessions, never mentioned again. Sarah aced her midterms. Dale actually smiled one morning, a real smile, not the grimace he usually wore. Bryce changed too, slowly. Started asking servers about their days instead of just marking down their mistakes. Started seeing customers as people instead of table turnover statistics. One afternoon, Madison saw him bring fresh coffee to an elderly woman who reminded her of Harold, dressed in old clothes, sitting alone, invisible to everyone else. Bryce didn't rush her, didn't watch the clock, just made sure she had what she needed. Madison caught his eye across the diner. He nodded, a small acknowledgement, a recognition that kindness wasn't weakness, that dignity wasn't a luxury, that the best measure of character was how you treated people who could do nothing for you. Harold had tested Madison. Now, without meaning to, Madison was testing everyone around her, not with surveillance or journals or private investigators, but with example, with choices, with a quiet demonstration that money didn't have to corrupt, that power could be used to protect instead of exploit, that Eleanor's legacy was still possible, still alive, still worth fighting for. She'd passed Harold's test. Now she was determined to pass her own. Victoria Pemberton filed her legal challenge on a Monday morning. Madison learned about it from Robert Chin, who called her at 6 a.m., his voice tight with controlled anger. She's claiming your father was mentally incompetent at the time he executed the will. She's alleging you manipulated him, took advantage of his diminished capacity, exerted undue influence. She's asking the court to void the entire will and redistribute the estate according to Maine's intestacy laws. Madison sat in her new apartment, one bedroom, clean, windows that locked, and felt the world tilt again. Can she do that? She can try. She won't succeed. We have overwhelming evidence of Harold's competence. But the process will be ugly, expensive, public. Robert paused. There's more. She's hired a public relations firm. They're already placing stories with local media. You should prepare yourself. The first article appeared that afternoon in the Portland Press Herald. Diner waitress inherits millions. Family cries foul. The story painted Victoria as a grieving daughter, confused and hurt by her father's inexplicable decisions. Madison was portrayed as a mysterious figure who'd somehow wormed her way into a vulnerable old man's life. The comment section was vicious. Gold digger, scam artist, home wrecker. People who'd never met Madison, who knew nothing about her or Harold, rendered judgment with the casual cruelty of anonymity. By Wednesday, television news had picked it up. Local stations ran segments with titles like Millionaire's Controversial Will and Did Waitress Manipulate Dying Billionaire? They showed footage of Harborview Diner, of Madison's old apartment building, of the Mercedes that had taken her to the will reading. They interviewed experts who speculated about elder abuse and cognitive decline. Victoria appeared on camera, perfectly coiffed and tearful, talking about her beloved father's confusion in his final months. Madison stopped going to the diner, not because she wanted to, but because customers started recognizing her, started whispering, started taking photos. One woman confronted her directly. You should be ashamed. Taking advantage of a sick old man. People like you make me sick. Sarah and Marcus tried to defend her. But what could they say? They hadn't known Harold, hadn't witnessed the 3 months of kindness in Booth 7. The security footage existed, but it was evidence for the courtroom, not public consumption. Madison was being tried in the court of public opinion, and public opinion had already reached its verdict. Guilty. Robert called again on Friday. Victoria's legal team contacted me with a settlement offer. She's willing to drop the challenge if you agree to accept $10 million and relinquish all claims to the Pemberton holding stake and the commercial portfolio. You'd keep the diner and the house Harold left you, but everything else reverts to the family. Madison sat in her apartment, curtains drawn against the news cameras that had found her address, and considered the offer. $10 million. More money than she'd ever need. Enough to take care of her mother, to go back to school, to disappear and start over somewhere else. The legal battle would end. The media scrutiny would stop. She could have her life back. What do you think I should do? She asked Robert. Financially? Take the settlement. The legal fees for fighting this will run into hundreds of thousands. The process will take years. The media attention will be relentless. Even though you'll win, and you will win, it'll cost you. In money, in stress, in privacy. $10 million is a generous offer. But Robert was quiet for a moment. But Harold didn't give you this inheritance so you'd run away at the first challenge. He gave it to you because you had Eleanor's character. Because you stood up for dignity when it wasn't convenient. Because you did the right thing even when people mocked you for it. He paused. What would Eleanor have done? Madison thought about the photograph. Eleanor in her apron, holding coffee and pie, smiling with pure joy. Eleanor who'd insisted on keeping Harborview Diner as a place for working people. Eleanor who'd made Harold promise never to change it, never to let wealth make him cruel. Eleanor who'd seen Harold when he was nobody, when he had nothing, and loved him anyway. Eleanor would fight, Madison said quietly. Yes, Robert agreed. She would. Then that's what I'll do. The next morning, Madison issued a statement through Robert's office. Brief, direct, true. Harold Pemberton was a remarkable man who taught me that character matters more than wealth. I will not dishonor his memory by accepting a settlement that contradicts his explicitly stated wishes. I will see this through to the end. The truth will speak for itself. Victoria's response was immediate and vicious. More articles appeared. Waitress refuses settlement. greed, or principle? A tabloid ran a piece claiming Madison had been secretly sleeping with Harold, that the relationship had been inappropriate, that there was more to the story than anyone knew. The lies multiplied like cancer, spreading faster than truth could chase them. Then Victoria made her boldest move. She called an emergency shareholders meeting of Pemberton Holdings, LLC, as majority stakeholder. Her combined shares with Trevor totaled 51%. She had the authority to do it. The meeting would be public, held at the Portland Harbor Hotel's Grand Ballroom. 200 investors, business partners, and commercial real estate professionals would attend. Victoria would present her case that Madison was unfit to hold shares in the company, that Harold should be contested, that the family needed to maintain control of the Pemberton legacy. Robert called Madison when he heard. This is a trap. She's chosen her territory, her audience. These are Portland's business elite. Her people, her connections. She's going to destroy you in front of everyone who matters in the city. Then I need to be there, Madison said. Madison, you don't have to do this. We can fight this in court. We don't need to engage in her theater. Yes, we do. Because if I don't show up, she wins anyway. She gets to tell her story without me there to tell mine. Madison took a breath. Harold fought his battle in booth 7. I have to fight mine in that ballroom. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. The timing felt deliberately cruel. The same time Harold used to arrive at the diner. Madison spent Friday night preparing, reading through Harold's journals, studying the private investigators' reports, watching the security footage until she'd memorized every frame. Sarah came to her apartment that night bringing clothes. You can't wear your uniform to this. You need to look the part. She'd borrowed a simple black dress from her sister, professional but not expensive. You're going to walk in there and tell the truth. That's all you need to do. Saturday morning, Madison woke at dawn. Couldn't eat, could barely breathe. She put on the black dress, pulled her hair back into a neat bun, wore no jewelry. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. A woman about to walk into a room full of millionaires and defend herself against accusations of manipulation and greed. A woman who 6 weeks ago had been sleeping in her car. The Mercedes arrived at 1:30. Robert had insisted on it. Appearances mattered, he said. Madison climbed into the back seat, her hands shaking. The drive to the Portland Harbor Hotel took 15 minutes. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough to wonder if she was making a terrible mistake. The ballroom was already packed when they arrived. 200 people in expensive suits and designer dresses, all of them watching as Madison entered. The whispers started immediately. There she is. That's the waitress. Can you believe the audacity? Victoria stood at the front of the room, flanked by her lawyers, dressed in black Chanel, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. Trevor stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but defiant. Madison walked to the front of the room, every eye tracking her movement. She felt like a lamb walking into a den of wolves. Felt like Daniel entering the lion's den. Felt like every metaphor for being outmatched and outgunned. But she kept walking, her worn shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor, her head held high. Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. How kind of you to join us, Miss Hayes. We were just about to begin. Madison took her seat at the table reserved for shareholders, directly across from Victoria. Robert sat beside her, his briefcase open, documents arranged with military precision. The moderator, a corporate attorney Victoria had hired, called the meeting to order. We are here, Victoria began, her voice carrying across the ballroom, to address a matter of grave concern to Pemberton Holdings and to my father's legacy. 6 weeks ago, my father passed away. In his will, he made certain unconventional decisions. Decisions that, I believe, do not reflect his true wishes or sound judgment. She pressed a button on the podium. A screen descended behind her, showing a photograph of Harold in his final years, frail, thin, looking every one of his 84 years. This is my father in his last months. A man who was struggling, confused, vulnerable. Madison's hands clenched under the table. That wasn't a Harold she'd known. It wasn't the man who'd carefully planned his test, who'd documented everything, who'd made choices with crystal clarity. Victoria continued. My father left $47 million worth of shares in this company to a woman he met 6 months ago. A waitress with no business experience, no education beyond high school, no qualifications whatsoever to be part of this organization. She gestured toward Madison. I mean, no disrespect to Miss Hayes' profession, but would any of you trust $47 million to someone based solely on the fact that they served you coffee? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Heads nodded. Victoria was playing her audience perfectly. My father was a brilliant businessman, Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. But in his final months, that brilliance was compromised. By grief, by age, by the loneliness that follows losing the love of your life. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Someone took advantage of that vulnerability. Someone recognized an opportunity and exploited it. That someone is sitting in this room today, claiming she deserves a fortune built over 50 years by my father's hard work. The room's hostility was palpable. Madison felt it pressing against her like a physical force. These people had already decided. Victoria had won before Madison even opened her mouth. If you're still not subscribed, drop a comment. What's holding you back? You won't want to miss what happens next. The moderator turned to Madison. Miss Hayes, you have the opportunity to respond. Madison stood slowly. Her legs trembled. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I'd like to tell you a story. The ballroom remained hostile. 200 faces stared at Madison with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright contempt. She stood behind the table, her hands gripping the edge to keep them from shaking, and looked at the crowd. These were Portland's elite, people who'd built fortunes, managed empires, made decisions that affected thousands of lives. They wore their wealth casually, like second skin, and they'd already decided she didn't belong among them. 6 months ago, Madison began, her voice gaining strength, I was serving the breakfast shift at Harborview Diner. A man came in and sat in booth 7. He wore old clothes. He ordered black coffee and apple pie. He paid with exact change from a coin purse. He didn't speak. He never left a tip. She paused, looking directly at Victoria. I didn't know his name was Harold Pemberton. I didn't know he was your father. I didn't know he was worth $200 million, or that he owned half the buildings in Portland. I didn't know anything except that he was there every single day at 2:15, and everyone else treated him like he was invisible. The room was quiet now, listening despite themselves. The other servers refused to take his table. My manager told me to move him along because he wasn't profitable. Customers complained that he made the diner look bad, but I saw something different. I saw someone who needed what we all need, to be seen, to matter, to be treated with basic human dignity. Madison's voice cracked slightly, so I gave him fresh coffee. I gave him the best slice of pie. I sat with him during slow hours and told him about my life, about my mother dying in hospice, about my eviction notice, about my dreams of becoming a teacher. I talked, and he listened, and that was our routine for 3 months. She turned to the screen behind Victoria, where Harold's photo still displayed. I had no idea I was being tested. No idea that every cup of coffee, every conversation, every moment of kindness was being documented. Harold hired private investigators, installed security cameras, kept detailed journals, not because he suspected me of deception, but because he needed proof that people like my mother's hero Eleanor still existed. People who treat others well not because of what they can get, but because it's the right thing to do. Madison nodded to Robert, who pressed a button on his laptop. The screen changed, showing the security footage from a diner. The ballroom watched as Madison served Harold, wiped his table, sat across from him talking while he listened silently. They watched other servers refuse to approach booth 7. Watched Dale tell Madison to hurry up. Watched customers look at Harold with disgust. Harold wasn't testing my coffee-making skills, Madison continued. He was searching for something he'd lost when Eleanor died. His wife, his partner, the woman who'd loved him when he had nothing. Eleanor worked as a waitress at that same diner 50 years ago. She gave Harold free coffee when he couldn't pay. She saw him when he was nobody. And that's what Harold was searching for in his final months. proof that people still existed who could see past wealth and status to the human being underneath. The footage continued. 3 months compressed into 5 minutes. Madison's consistent kindness. Harold's small acknowledgments. The ritual that had developed between them. The room's hostility was softening. She could feel it. They were listening, really listening. In his final years, Madison said, her voice clear and strong now, Harold Pemberton wasn't interested in accumulating more wealth. He'd already done that. He wasn't interested in building a bigger empire. He'd already built one. He was interested in one thing only: character. Finding someone who had Eleanor's heart. Someone who would use his resources the way she would have. Not for personal gain, but to help others. To create dignity. To remember that wealth is a responsibility. She turned back to face the crowd. I'm not a businesswoman. I've never pretended to be. I barely graduated high school because I had to work full-time to support my mother. I have no MBA, no connections, no experience managing millions of dollars. Victoria is right about all of that. Murmurs of agreement. Victoria's smile returned. But Harold didn't leave me those shares because of my business qualifications. He left them to me because of something that can't be taught in business schools or learned in boardrooms. He left them because I passed a test that most people in this room would have failed. The smile dropped from Victoria's face. Madison nodded to Robert again. New documents appeared on the screen. These are excerpts from Harold's journals. Let me read you what he wrote about his family. She read the entries carefully, methodically. Harold's documentation of Victoria's failed businesses, all funded by his money. Trevor's gambling debts, bailed out repeatedly. Their constant requests for more money, more support, more of everything. Their anger when Harold suggested they work for what they wanted. Their absence during Eleanor's final illness, too busy, they'd said, to sit with a dying woman. Then Madison read Harold's words about herself, his observations about her kindness under pressure, his investigation proving she'd never researched his identity, his conclusion that she reminded him of Eleanor, his explicit reasoning for every decision in the will. Harold made these choices with complete clarity, Madison said. He knew they'd be challenged. He knew people would assume I'd manipulated him. So he documented everything, every observation, every reason, every parallel between what I did and what Eleanor used to do. She looked directly at Victoria. Your father loved you. That's why he left you $5 million and a house worth millions more. But he didn't trust you to carry forward the legacy he built with Eleanor, because you'd already shown him what you'd do with it. You'd failed 3 businesses he funded. You'd asked for more money while refusing to work for it. You treated his wealth as your birthright instead of his accomplishment. Victoria stood abruptly. How dare you? I'm not finished, Madison said, her voice cutting through Victoria's objection. You want to talk about my qualifications? Fine. In the 6 weeks since I inherited those properties, I've met with every single tenant, learned their names, heard their stories, restructured leases for struggling businesses, canceled an eviction for a bookstore that couldn't afford the previous owner's rent increase, fixed a walk-in freezer at Harborview Diner for $8,000 because keeping it running meant my employees could pay their rent. She paused. That's what Eleanor would have done. That's what Harold wanted. Not maximum profit, not aggressive expansion, but responsible stewardship that remembers building's house, human dreams. The screen changed again, showing the proposal Robert had prepared. Eleanor Pemberton Community Center, funded by the rental income from the commercial portfolio Harold left me. Free meals for seniors, job training for people re-entering society, educational support for working families, a place where dignity is the currency that matters. Madison looked around the room. You can vote to support Victoria's challenge. You can try to strip those shares from me and return them to a family that sees them as entitlement rather than responsibility. Or you can honor what Harold and Eleanor actually built, a legacy of community, dignity, and second chances. She sat down. The room was silent. Madison had said everything she could say. Now it was up to them. Victoria stood again, her face flushed with rage. This is emotional manipulation. Pretty stories about coffee and kindness don't change the facts. My father was not in his right mind. His will should be. Objection. A voice from the back of the room. Old. steady, carrying the weight of authority. The crowd turned. An elderly woman stood slowly from her seat in the last row. She was in her 90s, Madison guessed, with white hair and a face mapped with lines that spoke of a long, full life. She wore a simple gray dress and sensible shoes. No diamonds, no designer labels. But when she stood, the entire room paid attention. "Martha Wellington," someone whispered. "Oh my God, that's Martha Wellington." Robert leaned close to Madison. "She's Portland's oldest investor. Been in commercial real estate for 70 years. If she speaks, people listen." Martha Wellington walked slowly to the front of the room, her cane clicking against the floor with each step. The crowd parted for her like Moses parting the Red Sea. She stopped beside Madison's table and looked at Victoria with eyes that had seen everything and forgiven nothing. "I knew Eleanor Pemberton," Martha said. Her voice cleared despite her age. "We started in this business together in 1955. Two women in a world that didn't want us. We built our empires brick by brick, fighting every step of the way." She turned to face the crowd. "Eleanor used to say that wealth is a test of character, that how you use money reveals who you really are. Harold passed that test every day of his life. He built an empire, yes, but he never forgot where he came from. Never forgot that buildings are more than investments, their homes, their livelihoods, their dreams." She looked at Victoria. "I watched you grow up, Victoria. Watched you expect everything and appreciate nothing. Watched you burn through your father's money on businesses you were too lazy to manage properly. Watched you absent yourself from your mother's deathbed because you were too busy shopping in New York." Her voice was cold as winter. "You have no moral authority to challenge this will. None." Victoria's face went white. Martha turned to Madison. "I don't know you, young woman, but I know Eleanor's character when I see it, and I see it in you." She raised her cane and brought it down firmly on the floor. "I vote to uphold Harold's will in its entirety, and I move that this shareholders' meeting express unanimous support for Madison Hayes as a member of Pemberton Holdings." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then another investor stood, then another, then 10 more, then half the room. The applause started slowly, then built, echoing through the ballroom like thunder. Not everyone joined. Some of Victoria's allies remained seated, scowling. But enough stood. More than enough. The moderator looked shaken. "All in favor of Ms. Wellington's motion?" A chorus of ayes. Hands raised throughout the room. The moderator counted quickly, his face pale. "The motion passes with 78% support." Victoria stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and rage. Trevor had his head in his hands. Their lawyers were already packing their briefcases, recognizing a lost cause when they saw one. Martha Wellington turned to Madison one more time. "Use it well, child. Eleanor would expect nothing less." Then she walked back to her seat, the crowd parting for her again, this time with reverence. Robert leaned close to Madison. "That's it. It's over. Victoria's challenge has no legs now. Not with Martha Wellington against her. Not with 78% of shareholders supporting you." Madison couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She'd walked into this room expecting to be destroyed, and instead, impossibly, she'd won. 6 months later, Madison stood in Harborview Diner at 5 a.m. before the morning rush. The diner looked different now. New floors, properly fixed. New booths, comfortable but still familiar. New equipment in the kitchen, industrial grade, built to last. But the essence remained the same. The counter where Eleanor had once served coffee. The windows looking out on Harbor Street. The heart of the place, preserved and protected. Booth 7 looked exactly as it always had. Same vinyl seats, same chip table. A brass plaque was mounted on the wall beside it. Harold's Place, where everyone matters. Fresh flowers sat in a small vase on the table. Madison brought new ones every week. Next door, through the wall the construction crew had opened up, stood the Eleanor Pemberton Community Center. The space had been a vacant warehouse Harold owned. Now it housed a dining hall where seniors ate free meals every day. A job training center where people with criminal records learned marketable skills. A tutoring center where working parents could get help for their kids. A place where dignity was offered freely, no questions asked, no judgment rendered. Sarah ran the center's operations while finishing her MBA. fully funded, naturally. Marcus was head chef for both the diner and the center, his gambling addiction 2 months behind him, his family stable and thriving. Dale had retired with a generous pension, finally able to rest after decades of grinding survival. Even Bryce had transformed, his clipboard replaced with genuine care for the staff he once tormented. The media had eventually told the real story. Local news ran pieces about the Eleanor Pemberton Community Center, about Madison's management of the commercial properties, about the tenants whose businesses had been saved by restructured leases. The narrative shifted from Waitress scams Billionaire to ordinary woman honors extraordinary legacy. Victoria and Trevor had quietly withdrawn their legal challenge and disappeared from public view, their reputations in tatters. Madison enrolled in graduate school, pursuing the teaching degree she'd dreamed about for a decade. She took classes in the mornings, worked at the diner in the afternoons, managed her properties in the evenings. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. It was exactly what she'd been built for. Her mother had lived to see it all. The hospice care paid for and comprehensive had given Catherine Hayes 6 more months of relatively pain-free life. She'd visited the community center, sat in the diner's new booths, held Madison's hand and whispered, "You became exactly what I raised you to be." She'd passed peacefully 3 months ago, surrounded by love, her final medical bills paid in full, her daughter's hand in hers. Now Madison stood in the quiet diner, watching the sun rise over Portland Harbor, and thought about the question Harold had spent his final months trying to answer. Did people like Eleanor still exist? The answer was yes. They existed in every act of kindness offered without expectation, in every moment of dignity given to someone the world had forgotten, in every choice to see the human being instead of the profit margin. They existed in waitresses who gave fresh coffee to homeless men, in servers who treated everyone with respect, whether they tipped or not, in ordinary people doing small things that turned out to be extraordinary. Harold hadn't given Madison $55 million because she'd earned it through business acumen or strategic thinking. He'd given it to her because she'd proven that Eleanor's legacy was still alive, that character still mattered, that in a world obsessed with accumulation, some people still understood that the greatest investments we make are not in property or portfolios, but in each other. Madison walked to booth 7 and sat where Harold used to sit. She could almost feel his presence, the quiet observation, the test she hadn't known she was taking. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo album she'd created. Pictures of the community center's opening day, seniors enjoying their first free meal, former inmates graduating from job training, children getting tutoring help, tenants whose businesses had survived because someone chose compassion over profit. This was Harold's real fortune, not the money, though that helped, but the proof that kindness wasn't wasted, that dignity wasn't a luxury, that ordinary people given resources and trust could change the world one cup of coffee at a time. She thought about all the people watching this story, people working survival jobs, barely making rent, wondering if their small acts of kindness mattered, people feeling invisible in a world that measured worth in dollars, people afraid that wealth and power had won, that character didn't count anymore, and she wanted them to know it matters. Every kind word to a stranger, every moment of dignity offered to someone who seems to have nothing, every choice to see the human being behind the circumstances. Someone might be watching. Someone might be measuring. Someone might be looking for proof that people like Eleanor still exist. But even if no one's watching, even if there's no reward, no inheritance, no fairy tale ending, it still matters. Because kindness is its own reward. Because dignity is its own value. Because being seen, truly seen, is one of the most profound gifts we can give each other. Madison looked around the diner, at booth 7 with its brass plaque, at the community center visible through the open wall, at the morning light streaming through windows Eleanor had once looked through 70 years ago. She thought about Harold testing her without her knowledge, about Eleanor loving Harold when he was nobody, about the inheritance she'd received that was so much more than money. She thought about the question everyone needed to ask themselves. Who are the ghosts in your own life, the people you pass without seeing, whose stories you'll never know because you never asked? Do you have the grace to notice them, the courage to treat them like they matter? Because they do matter. We all do. Every single one of us. From billionaires in boardrooms to waitresses and diners, from people sleeping in cars to people sleeping in mansions. We all need to be seen. We all deserve dignity. We all pass through this world leaving ripples. The only question is what kind. Madison stood and walked to the diner's door, ready to open for the breakfast rush, ready for another day of serving coffee and pie, of managing properties and running a nonprofit, of balancing wealth and responsibility, of honoring a legacy she'd inherited by accident and carried forward by choice. She unlocked the door and flipped the sign from closed to open. The first customer was already waiting, an elderly man in worn clothes, shuffling toward the entrance with uncertain steps. Madison smiled and held the door open. "Welcome to Harbor View," she said warmly. "Would you like to sit in booth 7? It's got the best view in the house." The man looked at her with watery eyes, surprised to be seen, to be welcomed, to matter. "Thank you," he whispered. "Fresh coffee?" Madison asked. He nodded. She poured from a new pot, the steam rising fragrant and warm. Serve him the best slice of apple pie from that morning's batch. Wiped down his table even though it was already clean. And when the breakfast rush slowed, she pulled up a chair and talked to him, asked his name, heard his story, saw him. Because somewhere, somehow, Eleanor was watching, and Harold was smiling, and their legacy, the real one, the one that mattered, was still alive. Hit the like button if this story reminded you why kindness matters. Drop a comment. Who are the invisible people in your life that you need to start seeing? And subscribe, because in a world that tells us only money matters, we need to keep reminding each other that character matters more. Share this with someone who needs to believe that their small acts of kindness aren't wasted, that they're being observed, valued, and rewarded in ways they can't yet imagine. Because the greatest investments we make are not in buildings or bank accounts, but in each other. A cup of coffee, a moment of dignity, a choice to see someone the world has forgotten. These things ripple outward in ways we can never predict. These things change lives. These things prove that people like Eleanor, people like Harold, people like you still exist. And that makes all the difference.